You ever tried to bounce on a trampoline before? You ever tried to do it without bending your knees? It's pretty much impossible. I mean, you get a little bit of bounce at the start, but eventually you just slow down and you're just left standing there. And it just doesn't work. And people start wondering why you're standing on a trampoline. It doesn't really look like you want to be there. Have you ever tried to bounce on a concrete floor? That doesn't work either. You see, a surface needs certain qualities to be bouncy, to be springy, right? And no matter how hard you try, a concrete floor is just not gonna cut it. The fact of the matter is you need a flexible material and the willingness to bend your knees in order to make bouncing possible. And it's the same with marriage. You need both people to give for each other. You need both people to have flexible lives, to be flexible in their preferences, in their tastes, in their opinions, in their love, in order to make marriage work. You know, Paul talks about this in Ephesians 5. He outlines the relationship that is supposed to happen between a husband and a wife. And you know what? It's a giving relationship. And so with that, let's dive in. Let's take a look at this. Ephesians 5, verses 22 and 25 start like this. 22 starts with wives, submit. And 25 starts with husbands, love. The concept of submitting and loving, they really aren't that different from each other. Both are willful acts given to the other, not forced from the other. It is important that we actually make this distinction because this passage is often criticized for being chauvinistic towards men, because the idea of submission is generally negative. To be clear, that is not the way this passage is to be interpreted. This isn't like two dogs fighting and the one pins the other and barks in its face until it submits. Paul is telling the Ephesians what a healthy, God-honoring marriage is supposed to look like. And he is saying that it isn't a slave relationship, but it's actually a servant relationship instead. So in verse 25, it says, husbands love. And let's start there. You see, a husband is to love his wife. And you're probably thinking, yeah, obviously a husband is to love his wife. But you know, a lot of people don't get that part. A lot of people don't get exactly what that means. To love your wife means to respect her, to honor her, to actually serve her. You know, love really is an act of submission because we are putting someone else's needs first. To love your wife is to put your heart, your honor, your life in your wife's hands. I mean, talk about a vulnerable spot to be in. Because if she misuses your heart or abuses your heart or even just doesn't use your heart at all, it's like your heart gets stomped on and it hurts and it shapes you. See, loving your wife is trusting your wife in everything you do. And you trust her so much that you're willing to sacrifice for her and willing to serve her to the best of your abilities. It says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. You know, Christ didn't abuse, misuse, or neglect the church. He loved the church with a love that we can't even comprehend because he gave up his godship for a time to humble himself and become human. An infant, a toddler, a teenager, a young adult, a human. We all know those are hard phases of life to care for someone through or to go through personally. But here, the creator of the universe willingly put himself through that. Humiliating, right? This is how Christ served the church. And then he went further and died for the church. Humiliation through torture, through mocking, through defiling, and then being hung up on a piece of wood for everyone to watch him die. Why? Because he loves us. His love actually drove him to bend low and offer himself up for us. This is the kind of love that Paul is calling husbands to. He says, husbands, love your wives to the point of dying for them. There is no greater love than that. There is no greater submission than that. There is no greater act a servant could do than to give up their life for those they love. Verse 22 says, wives, submit. It might sound a little scary at first, but this is saying that a wife is to willfully submit to her husband. This is not husbands enslaving wives. That's not the message of Christ, and it never will be. It is important that women hear that men hear that too. This isn't about women becoming subordinates to men. When you willfully submit to your husband, you're making yourself vulnerable to them. It's an act of love. See, forceful submission is what a master does to a slave. But willful submission is what a servant does for who they love. Think about your wedding day. You made vows of some sort. And most likely they had things like loving, serving, honoring, respecting through all circumstances in them, right? Is that not a promise of submission? Saying, I will love you, I will respect you, I'll serve you. Is that not becoming vulnerable and submitting to someone? You know, on the end of this verse, it says, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. See, Christ gave himself up for the church. Christ gave himself up for the church, and so the church's response is to willfully give themselves up to Christ. Think of church history. How many people went to their deaths for the cause of Christ? I mean, just read Hebrews 11, right? People that were put to death, that were sawn in two, that struggled through life, but held on to faith. People that gave themselves up to Christ because Christ gave himself up for them. A wife submitting to her husband is a response of love. It's a response to the love that she knows her husband has for her. She can make herself vulnerable. She can and obey this command because she trusts that her husband is going to love her the way he's supposed to, the way he is commanded to. It's a two-way street. Wives submit, husbands love. There's still one road. You're to be united together, submitting to each other. And I hate how we get all up in arms about serving each other. I mean, isn't fighting for separateness within marriage actually dividing the marriage instead of unifying it? Aren't we supposed to be one flesh in marriage? This relationship is not about being a slave. This relationship is about being a servant. This is how a love relationship is whole. Husbands, love your wife. Wife, submit to your husband. You know, we serve each other out of the love we have for each other. Matthew 22, 37, 39 says to love God and to love others. This is what it means to follow God. This is so different than the world's perspective, where we are taught to take instead of give. When one takes, the other is drained. When both take, both are empty. But when you give for each other, marriage works, and we grow in love in ways that are deeper than we even know. And we reflect the love that Christ has for the world, to the world. Be vulnerable with each other. submit to each other and grow stronger together in the light of Christ.